All right, we're back with Peter Kent, Peter O'Sullivan. Sam's here as well. Because we now have two Peters, we're going to call Peter Kent PK, Peter O'Sullivan Pete. So let's go PK and then Pete. Can you all just give us a brief intro on yourselves and a little background?
Sure. So, Chris, my background is firstly as a chiropractor and then as a physiotherapist. And I worked for about 20 years in MSK practice. And I really enjoyed that, but I felt that I was missing some things, particularly around the biopsychosocial part. So, you know, seeing people with chronic pain day in, day out, I felt like there was the stuff in the psychosocial space that I couldn't manage well and didn't have the skills to access. And that led me to do a PhD in subgrouping methodology. And then I went and worked in Europe, in Denmark, for 7 years. But the subgrouping thing, I think, is interesting, but I still felt like it was missing something in terms of individualized care. And it was there that I met Pete and ended up in Perth, and Restore, the trial, comes from that.
Perfect. And what about you, Pete?
Yeah, well, I'm a Kiwi originally. I trained in the south of New Zealand, in Otago, and when I trained, I kind of did every workshop known to man, and I was very frustrated in clinical practice. I felt like a jack of all and a master of nothing, where I was just treating symptoms, and it deeply unsettled me. So I was really at a crossroad. I was like, do I go and do medicine or do I train in something else? And I bumped into some people who said, look, go to Australia. They're doing these postgraduate programs there that are really good. So I went to Perth, and I did my manual therapy training there. And I came out of that and I ended up working in two places. One was a private practice clinic where I could use my hands-on skills, and people would come in with aches and pains and they'd feel better and they'd go out, and I felt really good about myself. But my other job was at a pain clinic, and these were people who had not responded to the pushing and poking. They were deeply disabled, deeply distressed, on a pile of drugs. They were getting all these procedures done, and they were very, very distressed human beings. And I was like, whoa, my skill set could not work for that group of people. Some of these people I couldn't even touch. And I realized there was this massive gap in my understanding and skills. I kind of come from this background of seeing pain from a very biomechanical, structural perspective. And there was this kind of massive need of highly distressed and disabled human beings. So I'm like, I don't have the skills for these people. So that led me on. I was like, well, I'm either going to have to, again, crossroads, head down a different path. And I'm like, you know what? I'm going to start doing some research. So that kind of led me down my PhD route. And from that time, essentially, which is like, this is in the 90s, I've really run these tandem lines where I've always worked in clinical practice and had a point 0.5 position in Curtin University, with some teaching, but mainly research now. And that's kind of led me down this amazing journey of really testing a lot of the beliefs that we have, that I was trained in as a physio, that actually don't hold up at all. Amazingly, it's kind of like this painful process of realizing most of the stuff I thought was true wasn't true, but then actually replacing it with a broader understanding of pain, person-centeredness, understanding the real deep drivers of pain and disability, and then kind of this process of, unraveling a methodology or process of delivering care for these people. And that's been part of my journey. But, that's not just me. It's like there's been this monstrous expansion of understanding of pain and the drivers of pain, and lots of people around the world are adding to that. So it's kind of like the CFT approach is really just a culmination of a lot of things that have come together. And I suppose the beauty of it, it's been really tested in the clinic, evolved in the clinic and tested in the lab, I suppose. Yeah.
So primarily, we're going to discuss the Restore trial that y'all both were authors on. Peter PK was the primary author. Pete, you were the third author. This came out within, was it this month or last month? Very recently in the Lancet. Before we dive into it, Pete, you had just brought up CFT. Can either of y'all define and what cognitive functional therapy actually is?
Yeah. So we were like going, I remember having great debates. I was in Norway back in 2006, and that was the first trial of CFT with Schattenfursum. And we were like, what do we call this thing? We do. Like, it's got these cognitive elements. It's not CBT. It's got these, it's like this whole functional component of like giving people an awareness of their body, empowering them, building their self-efficacy in the body is a really strong functional component. So we're like, let's call it CFT. so essentially, if you kind of peel it back, the process is unraveling the complexity of pain for a person who might present to you, looking at all the components that be, the physical, cognitive, emotional, social, lifestyle, physical health components, and going, what are the key factors for that individual that are barriers for their recovery? And then that clinical reasoning process kind of leads you to the intervention, which is first to help people make sense of the pain. We know that people with pain, and particularly chronic pain, have been given so many reasons as to why they got pain, and often they're left completely confused. And I think we've got stuck in this diagnostic. We've got to give people a diagnosis. And we know diagnoses don't work well for chronic pain when there are multiple factors that are involved. And so the making sense of pain part is to kind of piece together the individual components from the person's story and from the examination and help them make sense of pain from their own lived experience and perspective and the factors that are going on for them in their life. And that really resonates with people. And often they'll go, you know what? It's like I bought in a puzzle with a whole lot of pieces and I didn't know what it looked like. And you've just helped me place those pieces so it makes sense to me. So that's the sense making part. And then part of that process is also just helping them understand that a whole lot of the shit they've been told is just not true. And that these rules that they've been given and these diagnoses they've been given don't need to define them. So that kind of then allows you to explore their goals. And often, I think as PTs, we're like, oh yeah, we got to do hands-on stuff. And often patients with pain are like, I want to get my life back. Like, what does that look like for you? And so the next part is to kind of go, what does getting your life look like? And so chap I saw yesterday, his life back was playing with his kids, confidence to, go to the garden, exercise, go for a run. He'd never dreamed he would do that again. So those goals become the targets of care, essentially. So we're not giving like generic exercise programs. The functional part is to go, you know what? We know that people in pain tend to become massively overprotective. They overguard the back, they slow up the movements, they start avoiding things. This is to build confidence back, to say, let's give you strategies to relax your body, become aware of it, build trust in it, get confidence in it, to get back to the stuff you love and engage with that in a confident way. And that's a really tough journey for people in pain. And that can take, the intervention was like 3 months long. And then the last component is like really targeting good lifestyle factors. So re-engaging with physical activity based on their preference. You're not saying, oh, you got to do this or that. It's like, what do you like? What are the stuff that you love to do that you will do? Particularly something that might engage you with, your friends. Then let's go for that. Let's make that the target. Let's get you back to work. Let's find the barriers of what's stopping you getting back to work and target that. Let's help you with your sleep. Let's, look at ways of getting you generally healthy. And so these kind of 3 pillars of making sense of exposure with pain control. And I think that's what's different about this approach as well. We don't just tell people, you know what, just suck it up and do it. We're like, let's explore ways in which you could use your body in a way that doesn't escalate pain, that like gives you a sense of control and empowerment to then learn to self-manage. And so at the end of that journey, we're giving you tools essentially to empower you to take control of your life and get back to living again, which is you're not dependent on me. We're coaching you to become your own coach, essentially, which is the process of the intervention.
Thanks for adding all of that. PK, do you have anything to add to that before?
No, that was great.
Perfect.
Thanks, PK. We're like the cheer squad for each other,
Let's go straight into the trial then. PK, do you want to give a primer of the setup of the
Sure.
study and exactly
Sure.
the reason for why you all performed the Restore trial?
Yeah, sure. So, as you probably know, the most difficult bit in many ways is getting the money. And we applied for a few years before getting the money from our peak medical funding body, the National Health and Medical Research Council. And our university was kind enough to top up that money for some of the expenses that weren't covered by the project brief. But from the outset, the study was designed to occur in two cities. We're a continent, and one was in Sydney on one side of the continent. We were in Perth on the other side. But the first step that we had to do was to train clinicians. The previous trials had 1 to 3 clinicians, and we deliberately wanted to have a large group of people, and we targeted people with minimal CFT exposure. They may have gone to a weekend workshop, but that was about it. And so what we wanted to see was, what is the effect if we take a bunch of relatively novice people, train them up to competency, and then step back and support them in whatever ways we need to support them. But really, the results are their results. It's not about us. So, Pete, maybe you would like to talk a little bit about the training.
Yeah. So what we'd learnt from the previous trials, PK said, we'd run. There was a trial, Schatten-Fursum's trial. There were 3 physiotherapists in that. There was a trial done in Ireland, Mary O'Keefe's trial. There were 3 physiotherapists in that. So we'd run. There'd been some criticism, like, this is a lot of training, you can't scale it. So we're like, okay, well, there was an opportunity to do this trial in Finland with a group of people in occupational, like in kind of community settings dealing with occupational physiotherapy. And so they kind of brought this group of physios in, and we did what would be called a light training. Where we kind of did 2 workshops that were split months apart. We kind of, explained what was going on. We brought patients and we demonstrated. We did some really very basic skills training, and then we repeated it, and it just didn't work. The physios were basically saying, yeah, I kind of understand this. Some were like going, that's just weird. That's just, these people are crazy. Like, this is crazy stuff. That wasn't a common theme. But a lot of them were saying, we kind of get it, but we just don't feel confident in skills to do this. We're like, we need mentoring. And that was really important. That was our hunch. But that was really important for us. So we knew that with this training program, we were saying, we don't want people to go into this trial unless we know they're competent. And so the first thing we did is we developed this competency standard to say, to be competent to deliver this intervention, you need to demonstrate all these different attributes and skills. And then we're like, well, it's on us to teach those skills. So we were kind of 3 broad pillars for the training. The first was knowledge. So, coming like a 2-day workshop where we'd talk about the knowledge, the understanding of the multidisciplinary nature of pain, person-centered care, clinical reasoning, and the key pillars of CFT, and then demonstrating that with a patient with chronic low back pain. The second part was a skill. So that a month later, they did a skills workshop, which was like developing skills around person-centered communication, exploring emotional factors, stuff that physios are not very comfortable with doing. What happens when a patient breaks down and cries? What happens when they start telling you about all the shit in their life? How do you respond to that? How do you validate people? How do you roll with them? How do you roll with resistance? How do you start shifting them to explore their goals and be less just focused on pain? How do you clinically reason that? How do you do behavioral experiments where you take someone who's terrified of bending and you give them graded exposure back towards the thing that they thought was going to break them? That's a confidence thing for the therapist. And we're like, a lot of the time we're like, oh my God, there's no way I would do that. So we would, the second part, the third part, which is the most important part, was mentoring. So we then had 2 groups, a group in Sydney, a group in Perth. We would take 8 physios across a weekend. Each one of them would work with someone with disabling low back pain. The trainer would work with them, sit with them. It's like tandem driving. If you're learning to drive, it's like you're with You got your driving instructors got a steering wheel as well, and you're like working together. So it's like this tandem process, and gradually over 4 weekends, each one of them got to watch each of them working. So it's pretty like full on. But we really supported them. Like, we want to just help you build confidence and skills around dealing with really disabled people. And the physios are like, we haven't seen these kinds of cases in our practice. These were really distressed and disabled people, but they're the people we wanted in the trial. And over the period of the 4 weekends, they got to go away between each month and practice these skills and work with patients and refine their skills. And we gradually saw this development of skills and confidence as they got the feedback. We'd also videotape the consultation, and we get them to go away and watch it. And I think that was so important, because we know as human beings, we have all these blind spots. We say we think we know what we know, or we say we think we know what we do, and when we look at it, it often isn't what we think. And it's like, yeah, no worries. I'm like, yeah, I'm cool with this stuff. And we hear this all the time, and we've seen it since the trials come out. Yeah, we do all that stuff. Well, I tell you, if you watch yourself, it's not always the way. We saw these moments where people are like, shit, I never realized when that person was telling me, or started to cry, I crossed my arms, I started looking away, and I giggled nervously. I didn't know I did that. And that was a signal to say, I'm not comfortable with your emotional distress. So we could kind of feed off that kind of feedback and just build this comfort around dealing with people's distress, exploring these factors, guiding them, building confidence back in the body with a whole variety of presentations. And then at the end of that period, we did a competency assessment. Now, not everyone was competent at that time, and I think that reflects natural learning. Some people develop these skills quicker than others. Some people have strengths in some areas and not in others. But everyone reached competency, within 6 weeks after that. And that was reassuring for us, because we had some physios were 2 years out. We didn't take any new grads. We said they had to be at least 2 years out working with people with back pain. Others had over 30 years of experience, and probably the older ones found it harder to just change their clinical habits, I think, than the younger ones. But that was reassuring for us. So that was kind of like the training package, where we're like, this is where you have to get to, and we're going to train you to that. And you can't get into the trial until you've got to that point where we're like going, yep, you're demonstrating all the things that we think are important to deliver this care. And then they went into the trial.
So now that these clinicians have made it through these competency checklists and skills, and now they can actually be a part of the trial, maybe we go into these 3 groups within the Restore trial.
Sure. So we recruited 492 people, and we randomized them to 3 groups, and they needed to be people with chronic low back pain. That means it needed to be more than 3 months, and we also required them to have been seeking care at least 6 weeks ago. As it turned out, these people had an average of pain episode duration of 4 years, and they were quite disabled. On a Roland Morris disability questionnaire, they had 13.5 points on average, which is quite a bit more than traditional low back pain trials, and 6 out of 10 of pain intensity, an average pain intensity over the previous fortnight. So although they've had pain for a long period of time, it's still significantly disabling and intense. And so we randomized people into 3 groups. The first group was usual care, where we did not interfere. We didn't try to influence in any way what they were already doing. There were no restrictions about what care they could seek, other than they couldn't seek cognitive functional therapy. Then there were 2 groups, which were cognitive functional therapy groups. They were identical, except that one of the groups had the capacity to have wearable movement sensor biofeedback. So both the CFT groups wore wearable wireless sensors on their low back during the consultations and home for the rest of the day, and then they sent the sensors back or brought them back. The difference with the biofeedback group was that both the clinicians and the patients could see that data, so they could use that in whatever way was appropriate on an individual person basis. So we divided them into 3 groups, and then they were treated through a 3-month period for up to 7 consultations. It was individualized, so for some people 2 might have been enough, but for some people 7 may have been required. On average, it was around 5 during that period. And then there was a 6-month follow-up. So everyone had the opportunity, and most had that took up that opportunity to be reviewed at 6 months. And the reason why was we had noticed in a couple of previous trials that the treatment effect seemed to be dropping off. So we thought maybe a booster was required. And in chronic condition management like diabetes and other conditions, it's quite normal to kind of review someone and see how they're going. And that's what we did. Shall I talk about results, or do you want to go somewhere else?
I want to chat briefly about the usual care in
Yeah,
the
sure.
pure heterogeneity of what usual care even is. Is
Sure.
that upsetting to you all, that usual care there is no standard, in the sense
Yeah.
that it's all over the place?
You go, Pete.
Yeah, look, the sad thing is we have had clinical guidelines for managing back pain for how long? And they haven't really changed. But if you look at what happens in the guidelines, what happens in clinical practice, it's very rarely related to the guidelines. So we have this kind of train that runs where, what do we know about people with pain? They say, I'm not listened to, I'm not validated, I'm not a parent, I don't understand what's going on, I don't have a plan. Like, I basically just bounce from one person to another looking for a solution. And for many of them, they just give up. They just give up. That's what's happening in primary care. So we got, God knows how many practitioners who treat pain, and we've got the traditional ones, chiro, physio, medical, etc. And then they bounce out to massage, acupuncture, iridology, like you name it. Basically, we got cottage industries that are essentially caring for our people with pain because we've failed them. So it's a real messy space where care, it's like we've not bridged the gap, in my mind, between what is evidence-based care and how to deliver it. And that's what we've seen in the literature when we say to physios, why don't you follow the guidelines? Like, well, I don't have the skills to confidence, or we're not remunerated to do that, or I don't feel confident to do that. So we revert to what we're confident to do, which is usually just treating signs and symptoms. And then we remunerate it in a way that you spend short periods of time with patients. We got no other time. You got no time to do anything except treat signs and symptoms. So, and then we hear physios go, well, our patients expect that. And it's like, well, we've put that on ourselves. We're like, what does a physio do? Massage. So what are you going to get when you go there? Massage. Like, hello. It's like we've created a monster for ourselves, in my mind, where people have an expectation. That's what we've done because that's the thing we've put in our own heads. And then people just roll through the system and they try everything or nothing, or they escalate into dangerous care, unhelpful care, surgery, injections, opioids, and we know what that looks like, or they just give up. It's horrible.
Chris, there's also the element that if we just look in the literature, we know very little about what usual care is in various parts of the world. And we also know very little about the characteristics and motivations of people that have pain, sometimes severe pain and disability, but don't seek care. We don't understand those people. So in this trial, we wanted to compare for absolutely pragmatic reasons with what's happening out there, not some artificial thing. There's absolutely an important role for research which compares best practice with a new practice. But that wasn't our research question. Our research question was what's happening out there and how different would it be if we added this? And when I say added it, what I'm pointing to is we did not restrict people in the CFT groups from seeking any other care. It was simply, if they had this option, what would they do? And I suspect that that's also something that happens in many trials. We don't usually in trials restrict people from not doing anything but this thing. Whether they tell us or not, they make their own decisions. So in this group, we had a capacity from a number of angles to collect information which might inform us on usual care. And people, increasingly now, there's this push in research that if you are going to compare with usual care, it'd be great to describe what that is so we know what we're comparing with. And we did that in Restore. So at baseline in this cohort, a bit over half, around 56%, were taking medication, and mostly that was analgesics and anti-inflammatories. So 30% of the group was taking one or the other, but also some of them were taking opioids. So around 20% were taking opioids. And so then we followed them through the period, and we looked at it in epochs of 3 months. And broadly, around 1 in 3 were care seeking in that period. We haven't done any trajectory research. We don't know if it's the same people in each epoch. They could have been different people in each epoch. But from self-report data, the most common people they were seeking care from, and the median was 3 consultations, so 1 a month, all the way through that 12-month period. The most common person they were seeking care from was a medical practitioner, and the most common was their general family medical practitioner. And the next most common was physiotherapist. So 75% were seeing a medical doctor, 25% a physio. And we don't know what that was for. So it could have been to review their medication. It could have been to review time off work. We don't know what that was for. We didn't have that level of data. But there's very little known about, as I said, about what usual care is. We know something about trajectory research, that people who have chronic pain often stay in the same trajectory, but very little about how that translates into care seeking. And it would be easy to have the idea that the people who have the most disability and the most pain are the people that are seeking the most care. But there's a really lovely study that was done by a Danish physiotherapist, Søren Moser, who followed 3,000 people who had persistent musculoskeletal pain, most of them low back pain, and he followed them for 10 years through the Danish health registry. So most consultations in Denmark, regardless of healthcare type, has some funding from the Danish government. So it's a very complete data set. And what he found was that a really interesting thing, about 10%, 8% to be more accurate, was high care seeking consistently through 10 years. And on average, the median for that was around 22, 23 consultations. Let's call it a visit every 2 weeks. And then at the other end of the spectrum, 40%, the biggest group, were seeking no care or extremely rare care. Now, what's interesting about those two is they were not very different on pain intensity. In the high care seeking group, it was 5 out of 10. That's their average pain. In the low or no care seeking group, it was 4 out of 10. In terms of number of pain sites, it was 5 in the healthcare seeking group. It was 4 in the almost no care. So it's not about pain intensity or pain distribution. In the middle was a medium group, which was seeking about 12. That lines up with the group that we sampled in the Restore trial. And then there were some groups that, started low and were ascending, and a group that started in the middle and got better over time, so they didn't seek so much care. But you couldn't see anything in the quantitative data that differentiate these groups. So Søren then interviewed 20 of them. And what he found was similar to what Pete was talking to. Most of them said, this isn't working for us. We're not getting the care, we're not getting the response that we're looking for when we care seek. It's just that these different groups reflected different people's response to that. In the high care seeking group, they just kept going. They just kept looking for the magic bullet or the magic person. And at the other end, the people that were seeking no or almost no care had decided, this system just isn't working for me. This is my life now, and I'll just get on with it. So I think this represents the population that we sampled. Now, there were some differences between the CFT groups and the usual care group in their average care seeking, but the numbers are not so different that they'd be statistically significant.
And just anecdotally to that as well, we've been able to, we've through the people who have come into the trial, a lot of them have, these weren't people who'd never had care. They came into the trial because they'd sought care, and a lot of them had had a lot of care. And again, what Peter's saying, they'd just given up. And I know through social media, there's been a lot of critique around the usual care group, but we wanted to, like Peter said, we wanted to go. We've been criticised in the past because you looked at CFT versus manual therapy and exercise, or group exercise and education, and people were like going, yeah, but probably they just would have got better on their own. It's like, well, okay, let's then look, in the realistic world. If you've got someone with chronic disabling back pain and they've failed everything, is there anything left for them? Or is this it? Is this just their lot? And best we could do is just reassure them and try and hope that they get a good life. Or is there something else we can offer these people? And that really was the question we were interested in, to say is, if we take this really tough group, and we know they're tough, we know these people have pain for a long time and they're just exhausted by health, failing healthcare, can we do better with them? And that's, to me, this essence of the Restore trial.
But it's also a question of, if these people are, and forgive me if this seems an oversimplification, but if these people are going nowhere, what happens if we add a new treatment? Well, it's not like this represents natural history, any subsequent change.
Yeah. I saw some comment yesterday around, this is just, the change in the Restore group was just, transition to, regression to the mean. It's like, well, that's why we had a control group. It was the weirdest thing I've ever seen, but it's like, that's why we had usual care, because we needed to make sure it wasn't regression to the mean.
I think, unfortunately, there's always going to be a lot of critics, but it seems like the study was very pragmatic and gave a good new piece of data set that we can start to compare with. Like you mentioned, there's been previous studies with some limitations, and this isn't the study that ends. There's going to be more built upon it.
It's part of the journey. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I do have a question with, you were discussing the usual care. Now, because the CFT groups were also eligible for usual care, were they also, did their numbers in regards to medication usage, opioid usage, et cetera, differ from the other groups?
Sam, that's a terrific question. And we have the data, and we will try and answer that question. So we have a study where we now have approval to do it, and we have all the people we need. We have an academic pharmacist and pharmacologist on board, and we're looking at a number of medications, but in particular opioids. So we're looking at two things. We're looking at, did it change over time, and did it change differentially in the groups, which is the question that you asked, and perhaps the most delicious question in that.
Going into the biofeedback, the group that actually received biofeedback, can you all elaborate more on exactly what that looked like throughout the day, and provide an example of someone gets in X position, what happens?
Sure. So there's sort of two parts to it. There's the bit that happens in the clinic, and then there's the bit that happens outside the clinic. So the bit in the clinic was the people who were in the biofeedback group, when they were having a physical examination, when they were having a behavioral experiment, when the clinician was experimenting with their movement patterns and the relationship of movement and pain, they could look at the sensors. So that this was live streaming from the sensors onto an iPad, and the iPad had a mannequin, so you could see it move in three dimensions. And it was also being streamed to a server without the clinician's intervention. And so within the clinic, you could look at what we call live data. So the mannequin moving, you could say, can you see what you're doing? You're doing it this way and that way. Can you tell me how that affects your pain? You could also set ways of doing it where, the clinician, the patient would say, well, why don't I try repeating this movement and doing it over and over? And then you could look at the data and see, how has that changed from when you first started doing it to how's it changed now, or from this session to the last session. And the last component was biofeedback, which was remote biofeedback. So this is when the patient or the participant left the clinic and went home. They would wear it for the rest of the day, and the clinician could program at an individual patient level reminders to do things and not do things And those reminders could be time-based, so reminding them to do particular exercises, for example, but they could also be situational based, meaning let's just say, for example, someone whose primary problem was sitting. Their problem might have been that they spent too much sitting slouched, or it may have been they spent too much time sitting erect and braced. Whatever it was, the clinician could program the biofeedback to remind them to do more of something or less of something. And the sensor, of course, would know they were in that position, and there could be a threshold period of time, and then it would give them the reminder that it had been programmed for. And that could be for more than one parameter. So that's what it would look like. It was basically a facilitatory or an inhibitory strategy or a reminder to do something.
So it was dependent on each clinician creating that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you go.
You go. No, you go.
Oh, no, I was going to say, you asked for an example. So it may be that someone's like fear avoidant of lumbar flexion, for example, and the therapist has gone, right, let's show you how to use this in the lab. So like when you're bending, notice here, you're not bending your back. And so during the course of that treatment, they might be teaching them to relax and build a sense of confidence around relaxing their back and flexing it. And then they may set that up as a parameter at home, that if the person is not doing that, then it would be a reminder. It's like, oh shit. Okay, I need to pay more attention to relaxing my back and bending it, for example. That would be an example of how that might be used.
The other reason for the sensors was outside of the assessment of effect. It was about us trying to understand mechanisms. So to look at the relationship between change in pain over time, and change in movement over time, and its relationship with change in pain or change in activity limitation or change in distress, fear of movement, self-efficacy, catastrophization.
This is a bit of an aside from the paper, but the old view of things need to be rigid and stable and forcing that along patients, can there be an argument that potentially forcing variability or these positions that people are afraid to move into is just as dogmatic?
So that's a really good question. The CFT approach is not, it's not judgmental. So it's very reflective. So it's like saying to someone, it's like if I said to you, like you came to see me, Chris, and you're like going, I've had this pain for a long time. It's really disrupting my life. It's really distressing. I'm really frightened of, the impact it has on my life. And I'm like, so what are the things that you most fear? What are the things you're avoiding? And you're like, bending over, picking stuff up, picking up my kids. That's the thing that really freaks me out. So, okay, let's look at that. Let's explore what you're doing. It's like, oh, okay. So when you go to do it, it's like you're tensing up and you're bracing your core. And it's like, what does that feel like? It's like, oh, it's really painful. So, okay, let's see if you can change that experience. So let's see what happens. So let's get you to relax your body and breathe and, break those protective rules and then see what happens. So like, oh, actually it makes me worse. Okay, let's try something else then. So it's not like you must do this. It's like, okay, let's see what that experience is like. It's like, yeah, actually kind of weirdly, that feels less painful. So it's like, okay, let's try that then. What do you reckon? It's like, yeah, okay, I'll give that a go. So it's not like, right, these are the rules. You mustn't do this. You must do this. It's like an exploration with the person of like, and we don't really know, like, as Peter said, we're going to explore this in the movement data. But if you look at the systematic reviews of all the data around people with pain and people without pain, how do they differ? What we know is that they move stiffer and slower and with less movement. And so that's like a protective mechanism. And it seems particularly the case for people with a lot of pain and, distress. It's like the body's in protective mode. So the question then is, and often that is related to pain-related fear and hypervigilance and catastrophic thinking. So the question is like, how do we disrupt that schema? How do we disrupt the schema to go, okay, so what if you don't protect it? What if you relax a move? What if you re-engage with a movement you think is going to damage you? Let's see what happens. So that's the exploration and going, what do you reckon? It's like, you know what, that feels kind of less painful and it's scary, but actually it gives me confidence. Then how about we trial that? So I think there's a misunderstanding that we're just setting another set of rules. What we're trying to do is, and there was a lovely paper with Kevin Wernley, looked at a mixed methods process of people going through this journey with disabling pain where they go, I protect and guard my vulnerable back, to saying, I'm now actually consciously relaxing and moving normally. Okay, so it's like I'm not teaching another weird thing. It's like just normal. What did you do before you hurt your back? What do you reckon you did when you picked up your kids? Oh, well, I would have never done that. I would just bend over and pick it up. Give that a go. So it's kind of like, then there's that process of then not even having to pay attention to the back, to go, just get on with living. So it's like a pathway to getting back to living where you don't pay attention to your back. Because what we know about people with pain is they pay a lot of attention to their back. And often it's linked to a whole lot of rules that restrict them, guard them, overprotect them, and don't help them. Now, if they are helping them, go for it. But they wouldn't have been in the trial.
And
does that make sense?
That does make sense. And sure. PK, you can go.
Yeah, sure. I was just going to say, Pete's talk to, it's not just about do the opposite of what you've been told and push through. I think another element to it is, in the trial, we recorded what were the 3 things that people had the most difficulty with. And it's true that the most common things were bending forward and also with lifting things, which is usually bending forward. But there was an incredible variety of other things, and not everyone had a problem with flexion, and not everyone had a problem with lifting. And similarly, in the single case series, the repeated single case series that Pete was talking about, Kevin Wernley's study, some people had a problem with flexion, some people didn't. Some people had a problem with sitting, some people didn't. Some people didn't have a problem with any physical movements. They could do everything. That wasn't there wasn't a relationship between movement and their pain. So other things needed to be the targets. So my point is just, particularly in the kind of media hype and you need to have a sort of 90-second bite. It gets a bit dumbed down to it's all about pushing through flexion. But it's really, as Pete was saying, it's at an individual patient level. It's about what are their limitations, what are their goals, and working with those.
So if we're not going to have it as just pushing through flexion, which is very understandable because it does dilute it down, if we try to condense it into explaining what a treatment session actually looks like, how do you describe it? What does an isolated CFT session look like? Yes, it's individualized, but what are the overarching principles?
Yeah, okay, cool. So let me give you an example. So saw a guy a week ago, very disabled, very distressed, back pain. We first do an Orobro screening tool where we go, right, the Orobro is like a short screening tool that identifies level of pain, impact on sleep, daily living, anxiety, stress, depression, fear of going back to work, avoidance of movement, pain persistence. So we get a screening tool to go, right, what's the profile here? And that gives us something around complexity, but it also gives you something around the different factors that might be interplaying. And so typically this would be someone with a Orobro score around late 60s to 70. So really disabled, high levels of pain, really distressed, avoidant of movement and activity and work. So that gives us a profile straight away. We look at the body chart, person comes in, we go, tell me your story. First question, tell me your story. They can start that story wherever they want. And often they don't start it where they think, where we think they would start. It started back, I used to be this guy. I used to be fit and healthy and strong. And now I'm weak and broken and I can't do anything in my life. And I've been through all this treatment. I've had these scans. I've been told my back's screwed. I've had like 9 injections in my spine. I've stopped doing everything. And I've been told my only option is a 3-level fusion. And I don't want it. And I'm frightened. I don't know what to do. So we're like, shit, that sounds really tough. Can you tell me a bit more about what that's like for you? Yeah, like I'm terrified to move. So I don't. So I've avoided now all activities. I can sit, I can't stand, I can't walk, so I avoid it. I've stopped doing all physical activity. I don't go out and socialize. So my life is just, closed right down. It's like, okay. So what I'm hearing is the key things for you are around standing and walking. What happens when you do that? So you start unpacking that, and then it's like, of course, you screen out for red flags and the other factors, and then you go, let's check that out. So what are we going to look at? We're going to look at standing and walking. He gets relief with forward bending and flexion, and sitting gives him relief. He has major problems when he stands and walks. Straight away, he avoids loading. His pain is more right-sided. He completely avoids loading the right leg. When he loads it, he clenches his whole body when he goes to load it, and he gets this increase of pain. So like, what do you notice you do when you stand on that right foot? It's like, I don't know. It's like, are you breathing? Actually, no, I'm not. Feel the muscles around your body. What are they doing? They're really tense. I didn't know I was doing that. It's like, okay, so let's do a little experiment. Let's see what happens if you stand on that leg and you relax your body. Take the weight into your legs, breathe into your belly, relax your body. What happens? It's like, you know what? That doesn't hurt as much. What does that tell you? It's telling me that when I tense up, my pain's worse. Oh, that's interesting. So let's take that a bit further. Let's start loading that leg. Let's get you into, doing some steps. What happens then? It's like, oh shit, that normally hurts me. Let's try it differently. So you start going through this process of going, what's your primary concern? What's been your journey? What is the impact on you? What is your body's response? Let's do some experiments to check that out. And then at the end of that session, we can sit down and go, you know what? Yeah, you don't have a perfect looking spine. But the thing that's interesting is that you look like you have a lot more control on this than what you realize. And that if your process of dealing with the pain is becoming overprotective or really protective and then avoidant, and that's really led you down a dark path that's impacted on your mood, it's made you fearful and avoidant, and that's kind of ruining your life. He's going, you've got it. But what we've noticed is if you start relaxing and moving, it looks like it's not as painful. So how about we set a plan? Because I'm really clear on your goals. Your goals is you don't want surgery. The pain's intolerable. So you want to have ways of having pain relief, but to re-engage with things that are really important to you, ability to stand and to walk, which is just a natural, normal function of activity that we need as human beings. Let's set a path for that. It's like, mate, I would love that. So then we go, okay, let's just set up a plan of you, one, becoming more aware, of giving you some strategies of like, getting power back into your legs, using that right leg, getting weight into it, building strength in it, relaxing your body, re-engaging with it, and realize it's safe. And so the journey begins from there, where we start building confidence, self-efficacy, pain control to get back to the things that he said he couldn't do. And you just see the switch happen in the brain. It's like, I had no idea I actually had some control over this. I've been going for like 9 injections. I've had physio. I've been pushed on rubbed in the bed. No one's actually got to the bottom of this mess. And this gives me hope and confidence that I can do something for myself. That would be a session.
Do either of y'all have practical tips for a lot of clinicians, at least in the US, where they only have a 15, 20, 30-minute eval?
Yeah.
Where these conversations and this relationship takes much longer
than an hour. It was one of the things I wrote down, actually. Like, our model's screwed. Like, you don't go and see a psychologist for 15 minutes. Why? You can't. It doesn't work. No one would expect that. It's crazy. PT's come from this background of, giving an exercise or treating symptoms, and it hasn't worked. Like, we've got back pain's the leading cause of disability. It hasn't worked. So what happens? People end up getting opioids and really expensive procedures and surgery. And then we're like going, oh, well, how can we just create this intervention that works in 15 minutes? It doesn't work in 15 minutes. It can't work in 15 minutes. We have to change the system. It's crazy. So that's a really tough answer, Chris. But we think, and maybe to come to the results, I think one of the really compelling parts of the results are the cost savings. We have to tell funders, if you really want to make a difference in the system, and policymakers, if you really want to help people in pain, you have to change the funding model, because it's cheaper in Australia to get a $50,000 fusion than to get this intervention. for the individual. Like the taxpayer funds $50,000 Fusion or the insurer, but it won't fund 7 sessions where the physio spends an hour on the first one and half an hour follow-ups. It won't fund that, but it will pay $1,000 for an injection or 50 grand for a fusion. That is crazy.
And so part of the reason for doing the health economic analysis was to look at, is slightly more expensive physio care cost saving in the long term? And the answer was yes. $5,000 plus per person over a 12-month period. Really what we're looking for is to open up a conversation with funders to say, does this look like a better model to you? Are you willing to fund a better model? Because if we can't change the funding model, we can't expect people to do this.
And I think that's driven back. I think it's just driven low value care. Like I literally in 1996, I was working in a clinical practice where I had 40 minutes for initial and 20 minutes for a follow up. And I'm like, I can't do that anymore. So I changed. I left, I think it was 30 and 15. I can't do that anymore. So at that time, I'm like, well, no one might come and pay for my service. So I set up a practice, whereas like an hour and a half an hour. And I've worked like that since 96. And if I hadn't, this intervention wouldn't have happened. It was through the time of listening to patients, of hearing their stories, of understanding what's happening to them, of exploring what was going on for them, of developing a different skill set around me. Instead of me doing stuff, it's actually empowering people. That has been the environment where this intervention's developed. And, I hear this all the time. Well, how do we do this in 15 minutes? You can't. It's like, it won't work. You can't develop a relationship with someone in 15 minutes. It's like, that's speed dating. It's crazy.
Yeah, I would say myself and Sam were both very lucky in clinic and remote. Most of our interactions are around 60 minutes. And I just graduated from PT school less than a year ago. And most of my prior classmates, I don't think any of them have that model where it's sometimes they have 15 to 20 minutes with patients that aren't even in the MSK chronic pain world. They may be in I know a buddy of mine who's in a memory care facility, and he's trying to get a thorough exam with someone who has dementia in 20 minutes. So
it's crazy.
It's just, I feel fortunate, but I know the vast majority of clinicians don't have that luxury.
Yeah, look, I get it. And I get that policymakers are going, oh my God, we got no money, right? We need to divest in shitty care and invest in good care. And the financial stuff stacks up. If you look at it, it's like we've kind of driven ourselves into this space by trying to adapt our care to the funding model. It's crazy. It's like, it doesn't work, hasn't worked, won't work. We've got to make that change. And unless we do, we're going to be stuck having the same conversations in 20 years' time. Well, I probably won't be having those conversations by then, but you guys will. It needs a broader conversation with policymakers and politicians and funders to go, you know what? Let's do a trial. Let's just do a trial.
There's also a social equity part to this, in that you can have a clientele who can pay for your care. They can pay for an hour consultation.
Exactly.
But there are many folk, maybe the most folk, who can't pay for that. And I think there's a recognition that the social determinants of health, and there's an increasing awareness that from research funding, but also from funding of care, we need to be mindful of not institutionalizing deprivation. And we haven't talked about where to from here, but we're involved in some implementation studies. And one of them, Pete, maybe you'd like to talk about the one in England.
Yeah, so Chris Hughen, Gurpreet Singh have got funding to run a CFT intervention in really tough community with people with lots of health comorbidities, migrant communities, low socioeconomic. to say, because what they know in the NHS, which is the National Health System there, these people are consuming extraordinary amounts of healthcare, like coming back 36 times to see a GP. They're highly distressed people. And to say, can we target those communities to deliver this kind of care, which is an empowerment model. It's like it validates, it listens, it explores, it provides support, partnership, things that people are like the consumer groups are asking for this, right? We don't deliver it. It's not like this is just popped out of thin air. The consumer groups have been calling for this kind of care and don't get it. So, we're really interested in how this model of care might be able to support some of these groups. So, the other area of work is in Aboriginal communities in Australia, which are the most highly vulnerable, traumatized communities we have in our country. And I'm sure you guys have your own communities in your countries. So Ivan Lynn's doing some amazing work in that space, just changing the conversation and partnering. Like, it's a different understanding of how you support people with chronic health conditions. And this isn't just for back pain, of course. This kind of model of care is for pain, which is a massive issue. Arthritis, we've got huge health burdens, and they're projected to get way worse in the next 30 years. This is not going away. And doing the same old shit that hasn't worked doesn't make any sense. We need a bigger conversation around this. And this is not a panacea. This is not like, this is a cure. This is like empowering people to go, you got a tough problem. Let's see if we can give you tools to actually get you back in charge. That ticks every box for guideline-based care, but it just doesn't happen because the systems don't allow it.
PK, do you want to dive more specifically into the results of the paper?
Sure. So there were sort of two sets of results. There's the clinical effectiveness results, and then there's the economic efficiency results. And so the primary outcome measure from a clinical effectiveness perspective was the role and loss disability questionnaire, so pain-related activity limitation. And what we saw was large and clinically important changes between the CFT groups and the usual care group, both at the end of the 3-month treatment period, but then it was sustained all the way to the end of 12 months. And then when we look at the secondary outcomes of pain intensity and those psychosocial elements of catastrophization and fear and pain self-efficacy, when we look at treatment satisfaction, when we looked at whatever was the secondary outcome, we saw exactly the same trajectory. We saw these large changes within the treatment period and sustained all the way through. Now, that's unusual. It's unusual we see sustained effects to the end of a 12-month follow-up period. It's even more unusual that we see everything change and stay sustained. And so that leads us to think two things. One is we have more confidence in the results because we saw it on everything we measured. But also, it just looks like something has changed that was important, whatever that thing was, and has kept changed over time. And that's pretty big news in back pain. In terms of the economic efficiency, we already really talked about the money side, and most of those gains were in terms of productivity because, paid and unpaid work, because typically in chronic pain and specifically in low back pain, that's where the money is. Yes, there's money in care seeking, but it's dwarfed by the economic costs which result from people not being able to do things in their life. Sorry, there's probably two more things I should say, Chris. One was there was no difference between the biofeedback group and the non-biofeedback group. So in the context of CFT, the sensors didn't seem to add to the treatment effect. And the last one was we talked earlier about encouraging people to do things that they have been avoiding. What we saw was CFT was safe. There was no difference in the prevalence of adverse events or serious adverse events. And we just didn't look at back pain related. This was everything in their life, any kind of adverse events over the 12 months.
And probably the last thing worth commenting on, Pete, is satisfaction. They liked it.
Yeah. So in
Like,
terms of very satisfied or satisfied, it was 19% in the usual care group, and it was about 80% in the CFT groups.
If the results did not show what they show, and let's say all three groups were very similar, how would you all make sense of that, or what would you think moving forward?
It's a really good question. I was, this, if you run a clinical trial, it is like this, multi-centered, training a whole bunch of physios. It's a monster of a thing to do. And it's very easy to go, yeah, that's nothing. That's like 5 years of a lot of people's lives have gone into that trial. So I had a quip that said, I put my heart and soul into this trial. This was a really important trial for us because the previous trials have been small. They've not been, they've had funding, but this is really on the pragmatic side of like, this has been, in our head, can we take a group of physios who put their hand up, say, yeah, I'm kind of interested in learning in this. Can we train them up to work with a group of patients that are not normally in clinical trials, but who cost the system a shitload of money? And can it make a difference for them? And one of the things I've always said about being involved in research is that we never set out to prove something. We set out to explore something. And we have already learned so much from doing this trial. We've learned a lot about how we think we need to train people going forward. But we always came to this saying, we don't know. Like I can remember talking to Peter a number of times going, I have no idea how this is going to fall out. We just don't know. This is a really tough group. And everything we're doing in this trial is completely countercultural. Like the messaging, the whole narrative around pain is countercultural. It goes against everything people believe about pain in society. So you're up against the system. You're up against people they bump into, they talk to, the internet, Google. This is a really tough gig. And so we always knew we would learn from it. We didn't know what we were going to find. And that's the other thing, just to highlight. We've embedded qualitative research also within the trial because we want to know about the personal experience. We want to know about the people who did benefit, who didn't benefit. We want to know about the journey to kind of get an understanding, because with a multi-dimensional intervention, we don't really know what the key drivers are. And so, Peter can probably talk about some of the mediation and moderation studies that will come from it. But the qualitative stuff really tells us something about this. We've done some earlier studies around qualitative to go, what is it with the people who have responded, and what did we know about the people we haven't? And I think the other thing that we have learned from this is that it didn't work for everybody. And so we know it's not enough. We know that there are people who we couldn't reach. We need to know more about those people so that we can deliver better care for them. So we don't sit back and go, oh, well, that's cool, let's do this. It's more like, what more can we learn? How can we evolve this process? How can we support health systems to care for people better? That's part of our journey.
And Chris, you asked, what would we have made of a null result? There was no difference between the groups. I think that would have been really sad. And, I think about my own clinical practice. I haven't been a clinician for the last 15 years, but I think about the moments when I said to people, I don't think I can do anything more for you. And how difficult that is, and how clearly in this cohort, for many people, they're at the point where they don't think the system can do anything for them either. If we'd had a result where we didn't make a difference at all, I think that would have been disheartening, and that we didn't find that gives us hope that there are new things that we can do. And as Pete said, it's not a panacea, it's not a cure-all, and CFT will evolve over time and other approaches will emerge, but it's a positive step on the process of we can do non-traditional things and make a difference. Maybe we should do that if we're failing patients. There's this thing where people say, the patient failed usual care or failed primary care and is now going on to secondary care or went on to head surgery. It's always struck me that this is the inverse. We failed them. We have to be able to do better than that. We need to own this and go, we just can't keep doing the same stuff when it's failing. We need to think more broadly than that. We have an obligation to do better than that.
And just on that, I don't know if you guys saw the paper that came out in the Lancet Rheumatology this week around burden of disease for back pain. But it basically has, it's like still the leading cause of disability, and it's going to get worse. Like the projections are like horrible throughout the world. They're not good. Like it's going to break health systems. Like we can't keep doing the same thing that hasn't worked year in, year out. We just can't. The health systems won't survive. They will collapse. And that's a big conversation we need to have around how we train people, how we work together within health systems, how we communicate with general practitioners. It's a big conversation here. So important.
PK alluded to it a little bit, but how do you all see things evolving with CFT, and what are some of these next steps as you, besides diving into some of the qualitative pieces and parts of the Restore trial, but besides that, what do things look like?
Yeah. So, really good question. So we're going to, I don't know how many papers are planned from the Restore from now, PK, but it's quite a lot.
About 18.
Yeah. So we're going to learn so much from this very rich data set. There's also a 3-year follow-up that's just about to be completed. So we're not just interested in what happens we want to know about the journey, because we know that pain trajectories are like a massive issue for us. So we don't know whether it was enough to stop at 6 months or whether we need to keep tracking these people over time. And I suspect for some people we do. I think we need to, just keep them on track, where if they have a flare up, they don't freak out, go to emergency, get opioids, get scanned, and get thrown down that path again. We need to have their trusted connection with a healthcare provider. That's my instinct from working in clinical practice. But we have a broader interest now. So we're involved in a number of implementation studies, because we now need to know so this is a clinical trial, but if we train groups of clinicians in their health service to deliver this care, does it work? Because we don't know that yet. So that's our really next big question is, can we implement something like this, both the training model and the treatment model? Because they're two different questions. One is, can we upskill clinicians? And we think the best way to do that is to train groups of clinicians. And we're leaning towards this idea of a train the trainer model, where we build up a community and we support that community, and then they become kind of self-fertilizing. We think that's the way that we have to go. And so we're really interested in testing that, which we're in plan to do that, and in a number of care settings in a number of different countries, to say, if we would partner with you and train up a group and you implement this intervention, does it make a difference for your people who are coming into your health systems? So that's really important for us to go from the clinician journey, but also to making the outcomes as well. So that are important things. We're also really interested in we've got pilot studies testing this model for other musculoskeletal conditions, because it makes sense. It's like, this is not just about back pain. So we have a broader interest in managing musculoskeletal pain better, because we know we've not done a good job on that for chronic pain conditions. That's another interest of ours as well. And then the co-care thing is like how we interact for the really tough cases with comorbid mental health, how we partner, how we use the CFT or the clinical reasoning framework to partner with other care providers, so that we are kind of partnering together to support really tough cases, which we do know we see out there.
Yes, and Pete went where I thought he wasn't going to, which was to talk about the co-care. But there's also another element, which is around creating a kind of community of practice, or a sort of support group where people have colleagues that they can talk to and bounce ideas off. And in the trial that occurred through Facebook and direct communication between clinicians in their cities, but part of the model of training clinicians in a group is so that now you have a community of practice where you can talk to. And part of that's around what I just said, mutual support. But the other part of it is that in the qualitative work that we've been doing interviews with people at the end of the training, at the end of the clinical trial, and asking them about their experience in the training and in the trial, but also asking them about their experience outside of the trial, applying this approach with people who may have chronic pain or maybe earlier in the clinical course, but in the reality of the clinic that they work in. And some report that their environments are supportive of that, and some report that their environments are not supportive of that at all. And so how do they marry that? What's their pathway? How do they resolve that? Did you want to talk to that at all, Pete?
Yeah, I think it's a bit like what we know about chronic pain. If you have pain and you're going through this journey and you have good support around you, you're way more likely to benefit, like those social determinants. If you're trying to deliver this model of care in an environment where everyone else is doing passive treatment, where the messages are completely the opposite to this, and you're trying to do it in 15 minutes, we are hearing that people get very distressed and often just drop out. We know there are a lot of dropouts of PT. And I think we are losing the best people from our profession, is what my gut instinct is. The people who really are self-reflective and go, I can't do this. This is not what I signed up for. So that's why we're very interested in this community, like building the community, because you can do that, ideally within a community practice, but that virtual community of just supporting we see it. I think, one of the things I reflect on in the social media world is so much like, tribalism and, nothing works and, ripping people down. It's like, it's a tough job. Like, it's a really tough gig. Like, I 3 days a week go into work and I work with people with really disabling pain of all varieties. It's a tough job. And if you don't have good support, you can burn out in that job. So we need to do a lot better, I think, of supporting communities. That's something we're really interested in doing. The last thing, equity. The other problem we have is that we're exporting the worst of our care to lower income countries. And we're interested in equity. So that is our broader plan, is to provide equitable access to knowledge and support to people in lower income countries. And I was talking to a colleague in a low income country yesterday about how we can support them. That's something that we really have a deep sense of responsibility, something we want to do as well. So, we gotta be busy. but we can't do that on our own. That's a collective. We want to partner with people who've got a similar desire to not profit from what we're doing, but to partner with what we're doing to just do better. And we want to partner with consumer groups as well, because we see them as the center of all of this. So it's not about us and them. It's about how can we partner with people with pain to support their journey, because it's a really tough journey. So that lens gets flipped away from this is what we're doing to what is it we can do to support you where you are in your time, this point in your life.
PK, do you have anything to add to that, or anything else with both of y'all of things you wanted to chat about with the paper, places for clinicians or people listening to direct resources to?
Sure. Well, one place is we have a website, which is restorebackpain.com, and that's an explanatory website for the clinical trial, but it also has other material there. So if people are interested, that's a really good place to go. I think the only other comment I would make would be, I think for me, the thing that I've learned most from observing the clinician journey through Restore is that it is quite a big shift a paradigm shift, and that we need to support clinicians. And I think where I've got to in my thinking, and where we've got to in our thinking, is we need to support clinicians in an ecosystem. And part of that is about remuneration for longer consultations, but part of it's also about having a supportive culture where there's people around that recognize that this is a valid way and maybe a useful way to approach treating people who have persistent pain, and to create all the supports that are required so people don't leave the profession because they're burned out and they can't keep doing this stuff anymore. But we don't want it to be like a little blip in their professional experience. What we would like is to work with, as Peter was saying, health services where there's a sufficient body of like-minded people where you create a self-sustaining community of practice. So it doesn't matter when people come and go, there's something that's sustained there. That seems to us a really ideal model for how do we make a difference in the long term.
Yeah, and probably the last part of that is, it's not just us. We've got to, we see this as being building, supporting communities and people and finding partnerships to work with people throughout the world who are interested in this journey, because not everyone is. But that's partnering with consumer groups as well as individuals and communities of practice, as Peter said, where they're like going, this is what we've had people come to us going, we've got an avalanche of need and we don't know how to meet it. We got clinicians who are just burnt out because they don't know what to do with this suffering, these people coming in. Where do they start? So it's actually, it's kind of like, we know it's a wicked problem. We've got so many levels of a need, training, policymakers, funding, capacity constraints that just make it so difficult. But if we don't have a crack at it, and I know there are other good people in the world who are having a crack at it, we need to get together, I think. And instead of, it's this against this, it's like, hey, how can we build this together rather than it being tribal? That we don't want tribal, and it was never meant to be tribal.
And the other stakeholders that we haven't mentioned yet are health service managers and people who are funding care coming to us saying, we look at our data and we can see this isn't working, and there has to be a better way. Can you work with us to explore a better way to do this? And I think we need all those stakeholders in the room to be able to make a systematic shift that will be able to endure.
Sam, any other final thoughts or questions? If not, I think it's a good spot to wrap up.
No, that was wonderful. Thank you both so much for your time.
It's a pleasure.
Yeah. Thank you.
Looks like you guys need to get to. Looks like you need to get to bed.
It's almost 8 our time, I think.
It's not too bad.
Yeah. I think we're both grandpas.
Well, thanks, guys.
Yeah. No, it's been fun chatting.
Good on you.
Good on you. See ya.